Assalamu alaikum. This is Huma Islam, your O levels Islamiyat teacher, and today's topic is Ummahatul Mu'mineen. It is from chapter 4 of paper 1, the first Islamic community, and Ummahatul Mu'mineen are the wives of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So it is mentioned in the Quran, An-Nabiyyu awla bil mu'minina min anfusihim wa azwajuhu ummahatuhum. The Prophet has a stronger affinity to the believers than they do themselves, and his wives are their mothers. So, where do we get the concept that the Prophet's wives are Ummahatul Mu'mineen? We get it from the Quran because Allah has mentioned it. The reason why they were declared as the mothers of the Mu'mineen is one of the reasons was so that after the passing of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, no one would be able to marry the widowed wives of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then for the remaining ummah up till Qiyamah, they will always remain as the mothers of the believers. Now, marital status of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, something that must be clear, because usually what happens is based on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's marriages, people have maligned and tried to, lower the status of the Prophet ﷺ and say that he was a womanizer, or he was interested in women, and they mock the status of the Prophet ﷺ. So what we have to do, as a teacher, I think it is my duty to clear the status. Although he is the Prophet, Allah clears the status of the Prophet himself. He does not need clearing. But for young minds and vulnerable minds, like naive minds, like the present day youth who don't have that much knowledge, but when their Prophet is accused, they don't know how to answer. So, in accordance to that, before the age of 25, now everybody who's ever been a teenager up to and through their youthhood up till the age of 25 knows that the most time that if a person feels attraction to the opposite gender is during the teenage. It's because you're entering into puberty, adolescence, and you start feeling attracted towards the opposite sex. And all of this, although it is wrong, the boyfriend, girlfriend, and the crushes that you all have are usually through this time, and all the experimentation that you do as to befriending the opposite gender usually happens in this age. Whereas the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was free from all these type of negative activities. Before the age of 25, he was never involved in any unchaste standards. Unchaste standards would be as to make boyfriend and girlfriend, to have an affair, or to have a crush on somebody, or to stare at somebody, or to visit some place where there's intermingling of the both genders. Nothing like that. He was pure. He had a sacred life, and everybody could also verify and bear witness to his sacred life. No scar on his character. So can you imagine this prime time, this vulnerable age, the Prophet had no scar on his character. And during the age of 25 to 50, he was married. He was in wedlock to Hazrat Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha. So like 25 to 50 is another prime time in which many people, even if they married once, some people will indulge in extramarital affairs, or some people will leave their wife and get married to somebody else, or get married with their present wife. It's usually this age in which temptations occur. But during this is also another stage of your prime time of your marriage, 25 to 50 years. In other words, near to 25 years, he remained married to Hazrat Khadija, who was widowed twice. Now, every young teenager, youth who wants to get married, they always want to marry someone young, or someone who's, a virgin. But look at the Prophet ﷺ. At the age of 25, he's willing to get married to a woman who is widowed twice, who's already been married twice. She has 3 children from the previous marriage. So what does that tell you about the Prophet? That was his focus. What Was the desire for a woman his focus in marriage? No, there was no such desire. Even today, many married men or widowed men, what do they do whenever they want to, if they're going to think about getting married again? They always want a virgin woman who's very young and very smart. Nobody even considers a widow or a divorcee. But the Prophet, being young and being in his youth and, agreeing to marry a woman who has already been widowed and has children of her own, shows that for the Prophet, the desire for women or any attraction, it was unimportant. It was unimportant in his life. Now, what else do we remember? That all of the Prophet's children were born from Hazrat Khatija radiallahu ta'ala anha. Now, all of the marriages that have been maligned and that the Prophet ﷺ has been accused of, that why did he get married so many times, and then our naive Muslims also say that, oh, why did the Prophet have to get married? All of those marriages took place from the age of 50 to 60. So out of a 63 years lifetime, only 10 years of marriages, multiple marriages, you cannot accuse a person of being having the desire for just women. And all of these marriages were done for political basis, done by the command of Allah. Uh, During his age 50 to 60, several marriages were performed to Sauda, Aisha, Hafsa, Zainab bint Huzaima, Salama, Zainab bint Jash, Juwairiya bint Haris, Habiba, Safiya, Maimuna bint Haris, Rehana, and Maria Kiptia was his slave girl. Now, out of all of his wives, including Khadija, Hazrat Aisha was the only virgin wife. In other words, the only wife that had never been married before. Although she was engaged before, but she was never married before. It is said that because she was engaged to a non-Muslim, that when this household announced being Muslim, then the engagement broke. Okay, and then from 60 to 63 years of the Prophet's age, no new marriage occurred. In 8 AH, the Prophet was ordered not to marry anyone after these wives. The wives of the Prophet ﷺ were announced as Ummahat al-Mu'mineen. Means mother, Ummahat is the plural of mother, and Mu'min means, woman, a believer, and Mu'mineen means the believers. So they are the mothers of the believers. And then in the same year, Muslims were restricted to marry only 4 marriages, and it is also mentioned that it's better that you marry only one. Why was this restriction? Because Arabs used to marry 100 times. They used to get married to 100 wives, divorce 100 times, reconcile 100 times. The restriction was levied on Arabs because they used to do multiple marriages and too many. And the West, those people who maligned the Prophet ﷺ of having so many marriages, in the same Bible that they read, it is mentioned that Hazrat Sulaiman had 500 wives. So look who, when we debate without knowledge, or we're accused without knowledge, and then we're stuck, we don't even know how to answer, then their Bible is full that Hazrat Sulaiman had 500 wives and God knows how many concubines. In other words, slave girls. Even the slave girls of the Prophet ﷺ and the companions are, criticized, whereas the Bible is full of different prophets and slavery and slave girls and, wedding and being married to a slave girl and so on. The Prophet's age was 25 years and Khadija's age was 40 years. Now, a person who is 40 years old, they know that how old you are and how your body is not as prime as it is as to a teenager in your youthhood. Okay, and they had children. She bore him his children. The sons were Qasim and Abdullah, and the daughters were Zainab, Kulthum, Ruqayya, and Fatima. The Prophet ﷺ never married any woman during her life. She died in the 10th year of prophecy, 11th Ramadan, at 65 years old, 3 years before Hijrat, and she's buried in Makkah. And remember, she died after the 3-year boycott because it took a toll on her health. She's buried in Makkah. Hazrat Ali, Allah be pleased with him, narrates that the Holy Prophet, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, said, Mary, the daughter of Imran, was the best among the women of the world of her time, and Khadija is the best amongst the women of this nation. So when you're answering a question about the wives, then remember you must put in a few hadiths mentioned about her. Khadija's support for her husband. Remember, Khadija was a great support for her husband. She financially supported her husband for stability, and he was free. When you're financially free, you are financially stable, then you are free to conduct your mission. Imagine if you had to worry about the bread and butter of the family. Because the business was thriving, they managed other people working for them, and then that is why that he could conduct his mission. That was the spreading of Islam. Emotional support she was also was given to him at the time of revelation. And what did she say? Allah will not degrade you as you help the orphans and the needy. Consoled and comforted him. First to agree, and remember, she's one of the first to agree because she is the first person he ran to, so she's the first Muslim woman and the first to accept Islam. She took him to her cousin Waraqa bin Nawfal to verify what he was, claiming that he was gifted with prophecy. She suffered the initial opposition and boycott. And then what do we see about their marriage? It was full of love and care. As a Prophet ﷺ, there's a quote, she believed in me when people rejected me. Okay, then after Khadija, he married, after the passing of Khadija, he married Sauda bint Zama. Her date of birth is 589 AD, and she was a Qurayshi woman. After the death of Khadija anha, the Prophet was sad and unconsolable, and you can tell how much he loved her. He was so sad, and everybody who would try to come and console him, it would not work. He had 4 very young daughters to look after, and he had to leave the house. He was preaching also. So it was very difficult for him. The companions proposed for him to marry Sauda, an early convert. She had migrated to Abyssinia with her husband Saqran bin Amr and son. Her husband died in Abyssinia, so she came back to Makkah. She was 50 at the same age as the Prophet ﷺ. In other words, she's also not some young, woman, and in which he was so desirous to marry her. She was brought in by the insistence of the companions so that she could look after the children and also be looked after herself because her husband has just died. She was the only Muslim in her family and was facing severe opposition. She also needed protection. The Prophet gave her protection. So it was vice versa. He was protecting her and she was protecting his children. So it was a marriage of compromise, basically. Sometimes, the people who accuse the Prophet of desiring women, if you look through the marriages, they're desiring a woman, you can't see it anywhere, basically. She was devoted to the Prophet and looked after his children very well. She was a simple and pious lady. She also cared for Aisha when she got married. When Hazrat Aisha got married, she was also very young, so Hazrat Sauda also used to care for her as well and guide her and look after her. Also gave her designated time and day with the Prophet to Aisha. She was so selfless. She was such a selfless lady that her time that was designated for the visiting of the Prophet to her, she gave that up for Hazrat Aisha. She migrated 1 year after Hijrat with the Prophet's children. In other words, when the Prophet migrated with Abu Bakr and Ali proceeded, uh, then after a year she was ordered to now come to Medina with the children. Her hujra and that of Aisha's were adjacent in the masjid. The Prophet loved her piety and simplicity. She was humble, kind, and affectionate. The Prophet said she was the most charitable, stayed at home after the Prophet's death. She used to pray Tahajjud and continue her worship up till sunrise. In other words, she was so pious. She passed away in 22 AH in Hazrat Umar's Caliphate. She was buried in Jannatul Baqi and she has only narrated 5 hadith. Aisha binti Abu Bakr. Aisha binti Abu Bakr. She was born in 606 AD. Her nickname was Humaira. In other words, the Prophet ﷺ gave her the nickname Humaira. Humaira means a woman with rosy cheeks, a fair lady with rosy cheeks. And she was also known as Abdullah, the mother of Abdullah. Abdullah, she did not bore any children herself. She didn't have any children. But as I told you, I mentioned this before, that she adopted her nephew, Abdullah bin Zubair, who was also her sister's son. And because of that Abdullah, she was known as Abdullah, the mother of Abdullah. Before migration, the nikah was performed. It is said, the 6-year-old and the 9-year-old concept is an old concept. It's near to being invalid. She was near to 16, 17, or 18 years old. On attaining puberty, the nikah was solemnized, and the nikah was solemnized, in Medina. In other words, the nikah happened in Mecca, but it was solemnized in Medina. After her marriage, her friends used to come and play. She had a great memory. Whatever heard, learned it by heart. In other words, she was a very intelligent girl because she's young. Young minds are very intelligent. They can, absorb a lot. And she also used to continue playing with her friends, her old playmates, and the Prophet never objected to it. She was the most learned in hadith. At Uhud, she served water for the wounded. She was with the Prophet in different battles, and she was with the Prophet at Hajj. But the Prophet, there's a hadith in which the Prophet mentions to Hazrat Aisha that you have been shown to me in my dreams on 3 nights. An angel was carrying you in a silken cloth and said to me, "This is your wife." And when I uncovered it, behold, it was you. I then said, "If this dream is from Allah, He will cause it to come true." Because she was very young and he could not comprehend that she would ever be his wife. But then if Allah showed her in a dream and his dreams were always true, then she was bound and destined to be his wife. Verses revealed in context to Hazrat Aisha. There are different events that occurred because of her. The Tayammum verses of Surah Al-Nisa, verse number 43, delay in Salah. It was the time when she was looking for her necklace, and then everybody was looking for it, and they got delayed, and there was no water to perform wudu. The Prophet was upset about this, and then the verses of the Tayammum were revealed that if you do not find water, then you can use pure earth. Then purify yourselves with clean earth, wiping your faces and hands. Then Surah Nur, from verse number 11 to 20, her sanctity has been revealed because she was accused. Hypocrites accused her of infidelity, basically, because they had gone to a war. I think it was Banu Mustalik, and on the way back, she left her hawda, her carriage, and she went to to use the bathroom. Well, not a bathroom. She went for the call of nature, and when the troops were about to move, they picked up the hawda, put it on the camel, and they just left, not realizing that Hazrat Aisha was not in there. So when she came back, she saw that there's the whole camp, the whole convoy has left. So she was sensible enough, she was intelligent enough. She said, "Okay, I'll sit here. When they realize I'm not in the camp, not in the convoy, they will come back to get me." So she stayed put. Now, there was a man, it was a common custom, and even today when the army goes a place, there's an advanced party, and then there's the delayed party, and there's the one that does an operation cleanup. Now, what happened was there was one person who was searching the camp for if they've left any belongings or any, harmed person or anything. So she fell asleep on where she was waiting, and when this person saw her, he said, "Inna lillahi wa inna ilaihi rajiun," and she instantly woke up and covered her face. Now, this person, she said that she told him that I've been left. The convoy didn't realize that I was not with them, so he allowed her to mount on his mount, whatever it was a horse, a camel, I can't remember right now. And he was the one who brought her back to Medina. Now, when she came into Medina with this person by herself, the hypocrites took opportunity of this event and they blamed Hazrat Aisha of infidelity, that she was unchaste and she had some sort of relation with this person. Now, the Prophet ﷺ, Hazrat Aisha, she fell ill when she went home. She didn't realize what was going on and the rumors that were going on, but she noticed that the Prophet ﷺ was not talking to her, was not paying so much attention to her as he used to. One day she went out with somebody, with her friends, and a mother of the person who was accusing her said she was cursing her own son. And Hazrat Aisha says, what type of a mother are you that you are accusing your own son? And then the mother said, don't you know what he's doing? And Hazrat Aisha said, no, I don't know. What's wrong? Why are you accusing him? Why are you cursing him? And then she was the one who told Hazrat Aisha that there's a rumor going around that you are unchaste, and he is a part of the spreaders of the rumor. Hazrat Aisha was very depressed when she heard that. She went to the Prophet and she asked him that what is being said, do you believe it? And the Prophet did not answer. So she the next thing that she said, she goes, okay, allow me to go to my parents' house. And he said, you may go. So she left to her parents' house. She went to her parents and she asked, you knew about this, you didn't say anything? And she stayed in her parents' house. And then finally, the verses in Surah Nur were revealed for her sanctity and her purity, her chastity. And then when these verses were revealed, the Prophet ﷺ came to Hazrat Aisha very happy and said, I'm so happy today. Allah has revealed your chastity in front of everybody. And Hazrat Aisha and Abu Bakr and her mother said, get up and thank the Prophet. And she, because she had a mind of her own and she was intelligent, she was young, and of course she was the wife, so she said, I am going to thank the Lord of Ibrahim. Whenever she was angry with Hazrat Muhammad, she always used to say the Lord of Ibrahim and not the Lord of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the verses that were revealed for her were, indeed, those who came up with that outrageous slander are a group of you. Do not think this is bad for you. Rather, it is good for you. They will be punished each according to their share of their sin. As for their mastermind, he will suffer a tremendous punishment. If only the believing men and women had thought well of one another when you heard this rumor and said, this is clearly an outrageous slander. In other words, Allah is saying that those people are going to be punished who accused her. And why didn't the believers speak, claim or say out that this is a lie? Why didn't they support Hazrat Aisha, basically? And then Surah Tahrim, again, the verses were revealed because of a mischief of Hafsa and Aisha. They both mocked the Prophet, they both teased him. Of course, it's a husband-wife relationship. It has that type of effect. And then it was mentioned in the Quran, O Prophet, why do you prohibit yourself from what Allah has made lawful to you, seeking to please your wives, and Allah is all forgiving, most merciful. Because the Prophet consumed honey, when you do honey, basically usually tastes and smells like the flower it has been consumed from. Now, and it was smelling, it was a typical different type of a smell. And he would drink this drink, the honey drink, from his wife Zainab bint Jash's house. And because they were a little bit jealous, the jealousy factor does come in where wives belong. And so they asked the Prophet ﷺ that why did you drink this, or you always smell like this? And he then vowed that I'm never going to drink this again. And then the Prophet was warned by Allah that something that Allah has declared halal in the Quran, how can you say that it is haram just to please your wives? And then a commanding, and then another command for menstruating women during Hajj and purification. This was also revealed for Hazrat Aisha because she started her periods and she was crying. And then the Prophet told her that, okay, you can do all the other rituals, but when it comes to tawaf, you will perform the tawaf afterwards, after purity. Final days of the Prophet ﷺ's life, he remained with Aisha in Aisha's hujra. He was also buried there. She lived on for 48 years after the Prophet ﷺ and died at 73 years of age on 17th of Ramadan in 58 AH. She narrated 2,210 hadiths. She spent time narrating and explaining hadiths. She was interpreter. She was also an interpreter of religious matters. She was a jurist of Sunnah, because remember she used to cross-question the Prophet ﷺ on the minutest details of Sunnah. She was a pioneer in devising the system of coordination between Quran and Hadith. In other words, she would interrelate the Quran and Hadith. The sad incident did occur in her life of the Battle of the Camel, and when she went to go and fight against the rebels who had assassinated Hazrat Usman, but then they came encounter with Hazrat Ali and the Battle of Jamal. Whenever she would remember it, she would curse herself. She was pious and Allah-fearing, regular fasting, performed pilgrimage again and again. She bought slaves and she also freed them. Hafsa bint Umar. Hafsa bint Umar was the daughter of the second caliph, and he was also from the 10 best companions. She was born 5 years before the prophethood in 605 AD, near to the same age as Hazrat Aisha. Her first husband was Qunais, reverted with her husband and family and migrated to Abyssinia. And then they migrated to Medina she also migrated to Medina with Qunais, her first husband. He was martyred in Badr and they had no children. After that, the Prophet proposed. Why did he propose? To strengthen the ties with Umar and his tribe. Because remember, Umar was very big headed and he had his own type of personality, to keep him, his ties and the tribe of the Bani Adi in his, in good books. That's why this nikah was performed. She was the custodian of the original manuscript of the Quran, in other words, and then it was known as Musaf Hafsa. She was second in knowledge to Aisha because she was again very young and she dedicated her life to understanding the Quran and Sunnah and teaching it. The Prophet guided her on many legal matters. She spent time praying, fasting, reading, and writing. Died, remember her father was also an orator, so she knew how to read and write. She died in 45 AH in Shaban during the Khilafat of Muawiyah and was buried in Jannatul Baqi. Before death, she asked her brothers to distribute her property amongst the poor. Now, Zainab bint Khuzaima. She was born in 595 AD. First married to Abdullah bin Jash. Abdullah bin Jash, he was martyred in Uhud. Abdullah bin Jash is the Pupo's son of the Prophet, the cousin of the Prophet. She was widowed and lived in poverty. Many people proposed to her, but she refused. The Prophet proposed to her considering the services of her husband. She accepted marry and then married the Prophet in 3 AH. She died 3 months after marriage. This was her shortest lived marriage. After 3 years after the marriage, she passed away. She passed away at the age of 30 and then she was buried in Jannatul Baqi. The Prophet was the one who prayed her funeral prayer. She always helped the poor and needy. She was generous. No one left her home empty handed. In other words, when anybody would come to her begging, she would always give them something. She was also given the title of Masakin, the mother of the poor. Salama. She was born in 580 to 596 AD. Hind bint Umayya ibn Mughira. Hind is her real name. Salama was the name that was given. And she was bint Umayya ibn Mughira. She belonged to the Qurayshi Makhzum tribe. Her first marriage was to Abdullah bin Abdul Asad Makhzumi, Abu Salama, the Prophet's Popo son basically. Barra bint Mutlib. Who was the Popo of the Prophet, whose son he was? Barra bint Mutlib. He was the 11th person to adopt Islam. Who was the 11th person to adopt Islam? Abu Salama, in other words, Abdullah bin Abdul Asad Makhzumi. She reverted to Islam with her husband, migrated to Abyssinia and Medina. Remember, whenever you're talking about a companion, the whether they migrated to Abyssinia or Medina is always important. And when they converted to Islam, that is always important because we're talking about the first Islamic community. Distinction: she was the first Muslim woman to migrate to Medina. Husband was martyred in Uhud. She married the Prophet in 4 AH, advised the Prophet at Hudaybiyah. Remember the Treaty of Hudaybiyah when the companions did not exit the ihram on the command? Then she was the one who advised the Prophet ﷺ that, okay, you exit the ihram and they will follow. And exact same thing happened. She accompanied the Prophet at Banu Mustalik, at Taif and Khaybar, and at the Battle of Hunain and the conquest of Makkah. Her recitation style, the way she would recite the Quran, was like the style of the Prophet ﷺ. She narrated hadith from Abu Salama, Fatima, and the Prophet ﷺ. In total, she has narrated 378 hadiths. She lived till 63 AH, up till the age of 84. Abu Huraira was the one who prayed her namaz janazah. She was the last wife to live. Zainab bint Jash, she was born in 590 AD. She is the proposed daughter of the Prophet ﷺ, the daughter of Umayma bint Abdul Muttalib. Her brother Abdullah bint Jash was the husband of Zainab bint Khuzaima, and her brother Abu Ahmad bint Jash was a religious poet. Her sister Hamna bint Jash, she had a sister called Hamna bint Jash. These were all the cousins of the Prophet ﷺ. She was an early revert, and first her name was Barra. In 3 she was married to Zaid bin Haritha. Who was Zaid bin Haritha? Zaid bin Haritha was the Prophet's freed slave and adopted son. Now remember, Zainab bint Jash is a free woman, and Zaid was a freed slave. There's a vast difference in the two statuses. Family opposed to status difference but piety. Now, the family of Zainab objected to this marriage because the Prophet ﷺ said, I'm going to make you marry Zaid. And she also didn't like it, but because the Prophet is saying so, she, said, okay, fine. Her family also objected to it, that he's a slave, he's a freed slave. But every marriage was based on wisdom. The removal, the abandonment of the concept of adopted sons and their adopted sons' wives being illegal to marry for the father-in-laws had to be demolished. So the Prophet's freed family opposed due to the status difference. Piety, quality to be considered. In other words, what was the quality that the Prophet considered? His piety, the piety of Zaid bin Haritha. She refused proposal of Zaid, but on the Prophet's insistence, agreed to do so. It was a difficult marriage. Why? Because it was incompatible. She never felt that he was compatible for her, so she was unhappy in this marriage. Now, it was due to this marriage that the outruling of the custom of adopted son being own son, adopting a son can never be your own son. In order to stop this tradition, the Prophet was ordered by Allah to marry Zainab. The Prophet was uncomfortable. In other words, Allah ordered Zaid to divorce Zainab and then for the Prophet to marry Zainab, right? Why? To show to the Arabs that your adopted son can never be your biological son, and as your biological son's wife is always haram for you up till Qiyamah. That, opposite to that, your adopted son's wife is not illegal to you if he dies or if they are divorced. It is mentioned in Surah Ahzab, verse number 37, and remember, O Prophet, when you said to the one for whom Allah has done a favor and you too have done a favor, keep your wife and fear Allah. In other words, the Prophet was saying, don't divorce her, while concealing within yourself what Allah was going to reveal. And so you were considering the people, whereas Allah was more worthy of your consideration. The Prophet was thinking that what are people going to think if I marry my adopted son's wife after he's just divorced her. So when Zaid totally lost interest in keeping his wife, remember it was an unhappy marriage, and Zaid is the only companion's name that is mentioned in the Quran. We gave her to you in marriage. This is the nikah that Hazrat Zainab boasts about, that my nikah was performed in the heavens. Allah was the one who performed my nikah, where the rest of the wives' nikahs were performed on earth. you in marriage so that there would be no blame on the believers for marrying their ex-wives, the ex-wives of their adopted sons after their divorce, and Allah's command is totally binding. Anas reports Zainab used to boast before other wives of the Prophet and say, Allah married me to the Prophet in the heavens. She was very generous. The longest handed of my wives will be the first to join me in paradise. This was a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, so you would mention this when you're mentioning Zainab bint Jash. Zainab was the first to die after the Prophet's passing away. She was 53 years old and she died in 28. She was buried in Jannatul Baqi. She used to earn her own living because she knew needlework. She refused financial help by the state. Any companion that used to send financial help, she used to refuse it. She said, I'll earn with my own money, and she used to sew clothes and do embroidery. Aisha has been, quotes, I have not seen any other woman more religious, pious, truthful, generous, charitable, or engaged in pleasure of Allah than Zainab. She helped the poor when she died. They were all distraught. In other words, the people that she helped when she finally passed away, they were all distraught. Now, Juwairiya bint Haris, 608 AD. All the wives that I've mentioned previously are the most important. And then Maria Kiptia is also important. These are the lesser important ones. Juwairiya bint Haris. In 5 AH, Banu Mustalik chief Haris attacked the Muslims. They lost and prisoner of war were captured. Juwairiya bint Haris and Bara bint Haris were the daughters of the chief of the Banu Mustalik. Juwairiya came under the custody of Thabit bin Qais. She requested to be released on ransom. The Prophet offered to pay her ransom and marry her if she wishes. Due to wedlock, in other words, she refused to stay under even the custody of Thabit ibn Qais. And because she was the chief's daughter, she was brought to the Prophet. The Prophet offered, okay, I'll pay for your ransom and then you are free to marry me if you wish. Due to the this wedlock of Juwairiya bint Haris, 600 prisoners of the Banu Mustalik were released because the relatives of the Prophet's wives could not be slaves. And she is the reason. In other words, this was a political move in which the Banu Mustalik also succumbed to, became subservient to the Muslim state. She died at 65 years of age, during Muawiyah's caliphate, and she was buried in Jannatul Baqi. She was very religious and spent time in prayer, narrated many traditions. So if she was married in 5 AH, so she only spent 5 years with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Habiba. Habiba, remember I've mentioned this before, that that Abu Sufyan was also the father-in-law of the Prophet ﷺ. She was born in 589 AD. Her name is Ramla bint Sufyan, daughter of Abu Sufyan. Her first marriage was to Ubaidah ibn Jash, migrated to Medina, had a baby girl called Habiba. That's why she's known as Habiba, the mother of Habiba. In Abyssinia, the same Ubaidah ibn Jash converted to Christianity, and Habiba left him. Of course, the nikah becomes invalid if one chooses another faith. After Iddat, the companions requested the Prophet ﷺ to marry her for her resettlement to save her from her father, because naturally they're in Medina and now her nikah has proved invalid because of her husband converting to Christianity. Her father is still a non-Muslim, so where is she going to go? How is she going to be saved? So after her completion of her iddat, the companions insisted the Prophet to take her under his custody. So after the companions requested the Prophet to marry her for her resettlement to save her from her father. She was pleased to marry the Prophet. Naturally, he was a Prophet and everybody loved him, so she was happy to marry him, and she received a meher of 400 dirham. She married him in 6th Hijri. Negus contracted the marriage because she was still in Abyssinia. It was Negus who asked her if you would like to marry, and he was the one who contracted the marriage. She was a staunch believer and she took care of the widows and orphans. She narrated 65 traditions, in other words, 65 hadiths. When Uthman was surrounded by rebels, she tried to provide him with food and water. Why? Because remember, she is from the Umayyad family, and Usman was from the Umayyad family, and they were cousins. She sacrificed a lot but remained steadfast. Of course, she sacrificed. She sacrificed. She went to Abyssinia. Her husband reverted. Then she suffered. Then she came back to, the Prophet ﷺ, and she had to sacrifice a lot for the sake of Islam. She died in 44 AH and buried in Jannatul Baqi. Safiya bint Hay. She was born in 610 AD. This is the same year that of revelation. She was the descendant of Hazrat Harun, in other words, the Jewish, the Prophet Musa's brother. Her name was Zainab, born in Medina. She belonged to the tribe of the Banu Nazir. When Banu Nazir was expelled, why were they expelled? Because they tried to assassinate the Prophet ﷺ. When they were expelled, they settled in Khaybar. Her first marriage was to Salam bin Mishkin. He divorced her. And then her second marriage was to Kinana bin Rabi. The third day Khaybar fell. Safiya was taken captive. Now imagine, she is the tribal leader's daughter. Third day Khaybar fell. She was taken as prisoner of war. The Prophet made her sit behind him and gave her his head covering. When she was brought in captive, because she was Jewish and Ahl Kitab, the Prophet gave her respect. He took off his head covering to cover her. It is said that he also knelt down so that she could rise onto the camel or the horse or whatever the mount was. The Prophet made her sit behind her, in other words, gave her respect, reached Medina and married her. She was given the option to be, that because there was no other way for her to be given respect. She would always be regarded as a slave. So the only way that she could regain her respect, and her Jewish, prestige, by marrying the Prophet ﷺ. She was kind, sympathetic, and generous, and sober, and open-handed. Usman's besieged, she took water for him, but disallowed, then appointed Hassan the task. At the time of Hazrat Usman's besiege, it was then also that she tried to take water for him. She is known as the storehouse of knowledge. Why? Because she also had the knowledge of the Torah, and then she also had the knowledge of the Quran. Hazrat Maimuna bint Haris, she was born in 594 AD. Name is Barra. She was from the tribe of Quraysh. Her first marriage was to Masood bin Amr. He divorced her. Second husband died. Sister-in-law of Abbas bin Muttalib. Hazrat Maimuna was the sister-in-law of Hazrat Abbas, and Hazrat Abbas was the one who insisted the Prophet that please marry her, she's by herself. Abbas proposed to the Prophet to marry her in 7 AH during Umrah, after Umrah Nikah was performed. Do you know when the Prophet came for Umrah? After 1 year after Hudaybiyah, that is when Abbas bin Muttalib requested the Prophet to marry her. Named the Blessed One as entered into Makkah after exile. The Prophet ﷺ named her the Blessed One. Why? Because it was that year that they entered into Makkah after an exile of, since they had migrated. The Prophet ﷺ called her symbol of goodness. Aisha narrates, Maimuna was God-fearing and had great regard for kith and kin. She freed many slaves. She narrated 46 hadiths based on complicated problems. She died in 51 AH. At the same place she was married, in other words, Makkah. Rehana bint Shamoon, she was from the Banu Qurayza. Banu Qurayza, remember, is the tribe that betrayed the Prophet ﷺ, and all of the men were killed. In 6 AH, she was taken as a prisoner of war. The Prophet offered her release. She was married to the Prophet ﷺ so that she could maintain her prestige. She died 10 years after the Prophet's passing away. Maria Qibtiya is the Egyptian Coptic slave girl. After Hudaybiyah, you sent letters to the Prophet ﷺ, sent letters to the king, etc. The Christian governor of Egypt, Muqawqis, gifted Maria to the Prophet ﷺ. He did not accept Islam, but warmly welcomed the messenger. He sent Prophet. He said that he did accept. No, Maria. The Egyptian Muqawqis, sorry, did not accept Islam, yes, but warmly welcomed the messengers that would come with letters and, information. He sent the Prophet some presents. Under prevailing custom, he sent Maria Qibtiya and Ibn and Sirin as a slave girl for the Prophet. She accepted Islam en route to Medina, and when she reached Medina, she married the Prophet ﷺ. She gained more respect when she bore Ibrahim, the son of the Prophet ﷺ. The baby died in infancy, and there's a hadith in which it is mentioned that my heart is saddened, tears are flowing from my eyes, but I will only say what pleases Allah. She was buried in Jannat al-Baqi. She was paid pension by Abu Bakr and Umar like the rest of the Ummahat al-Mu'mineen. It was a long lesson. I hope so. The things that you have to remember is when they were born, who were their parents before, who were they married to before, when did they marry the Prophet, under what circumstances, what were the benefits of the marriage. If any hadiths have been narrated about the wife, mention those, and any good, if she has done any good work during her life, mention that. That would be how you would address the question based on Ummahatul Mu'mineen. You're never asked about all 11 wives. You're usually asked about two wives or four wives, or like two out of four or three, never 11, all in all. Thank you.